Hello, everyone. Welcome for tuning in to the Lib Dem Podcast. Now, before we get into our usual light-hearted chat about things going on in the UK and in the Liberal Democrats, some of the topics we're going to talk about today will, of course, touch on the horrendous situation in the Middle East, in particular, with Gaza and Israel. Every local party across every political party will probably have people who have differing views on this subject. You've seen so far Labour MPs resigning from their position, Labour councillors resigning from their party. There'll be Lib Dems that think our party position goes too far, or not far enough, or disagree with it completely. These Lib Dems might think about resigning their membership or stepping down from their role in our executives or in our council groups. No one has all the solutions to this problem, and you shouldn't believe anyone that thinks they do. This is a raw, emotional, fast-moving situation where people are dying and misery is happening on a daily basis. From my point of view, I think we all just have to remember that what you believe, what the truth you hold on to, might not be the only truth that's out there, and that we need to be respectful of those who have differing opinions to us. We hope that one day that the people who are benefiting from the suffering of Israelis and Palestinians, who want to whip up anger and hate and death and misery, will soon no longer be in power, and that part of the Middle East might finally be at peace. I don't know when that will happen. I don't know how that will happen, but I do hope for that. Thank you very much to all our listeners and viewers, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. And you thought Cameron was the big comeback of the week. Well, it isn't. It's Richard Kemp is back on the Lib Dem Podcast. Welcome, everyone. My name is John Potter. I'm the leader of the Preston Lib Dems, and I host the Lib Dem Podcast. And we are back with one of the founding members, Richard Kemp. Obviously, mainstay of the party for 1 or 2 decades, and he's back on the podcast to give us his ever useful wisdom. Hello, Richard.
Well, that was very kind of you. I ought to stay away more often so I get a nice introduction when I do return.
Well, that's what the viewers want, you to stay away more often. I'll be absolutely honest.
I have been working very hard for LGA in a series of councils where we've taken control, so it's a good reason for being away.
Absolutely, yeah. And one of those areas where we have taken a little bit of control, see how we segued there, that was perfect, is we have, I think, the deputy leader of Mid Sussex and our candidate for the next general election, Alison Bennett. Hello, Alison.
Hello, John. Hi, Richard. Nice to see you both.
Right, guys, there's been, shall we say, a lot of news this last week, and we're going to touch on some of them regarding reshuffles, Suella, Cameron coming back, Rwanda, what's happening with Labour, where this all leaves the Tories. So I suppose, Richard, because you have been away for a little bit of time, I suppose we'll talk about the reshuffle to start with. Your impression of what the reshuffle means, the sacking of Suella, and how you generally think the Tories are at this moment in time.
Well, the only simile or metaphor that we can have here is definitely the Titanic, because I don't think it makes any difference what they do now. They're producing one incompetent cabinet to replace the last incompetent cabinet, which, funnily enough, replaced the last incompetent cabinet. So there's just this cycle of viciousness and nastiness. What is absolutely clear, that all they're dealing with is personalities now, not politics. There is no clear view from a Conservative government about what to do about any of the circumstances in which this country finds itself, many of which, of course, they have created. So I think the reshuffle is an irrelevance. It ain't going to last long. But as you mentioned, David Cameron, actually, he's probably the most intelligent and useful of all the people there, although I disagree with much of what he said. He is at least has an element of competence and is known to many of the international players. So Although it was a desperate last roll of the dice, as it's been described, bringing him back was probably the best and only thing they could do to give some legitimacy to a cabinet.
And Alison, I'm a colleague of mine in the office said when I was talking about the reshuffle and that saying that Sunak has kind of tried to purge a little bit of the right wingers in his group, and I said, well, Rishi Sunak is a right wing politician. I think by his nature, he's quite a right wing, and maybe he's just got rid of some of the populists. But as Richard said, has he actually done enough? Do you think to change the narrative?
In short, no. I thought it was pretty extraordinary when I think we all thought it was pretty extraordinary when David Cameron popped up in 10 Downing Street on Monday morning, and it turns out he's going to be our Foreign Secretary. I mean, when you've got 350 odd MPs, it's quite surprising that you can't get any of them to be a Foreign Secretary, and you think your best bet is to go for somebody who's not elected and not even in the Lords. I think there was some speculation that it had been initially offered to William Hague, and William Hague declined and suggested he gives David a phone. No, I mean, it just reeks of desperation to me that this is the best option open to Sunak at this point in time.
Do you think it's talent, or do you think it was the fact that the Tory party is so riven with division that actually at least David Cameron isn't going to do something stupid or go off and do what Suella did, which was basically have her own agenda?
I mean, I think David Cameron's like much more likely to, stick to the rules of collective responsibility. But I think in terms of the whole of the parliamentary party, he's driven a wedge between the cabinet and a lot of the backbenchers by having kind of abandoned or got rid of Suella. And, to be clear, getting rid of Suella Braverman was absolutely the right thing to do. But in terms of those dynamics within the Conservative Parliamentary Party, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
What do you think, Richard? I mean, there was some. I remember when the news came out. I was in Monday. On Monday, I was in Manchester speaking to some of the Lib Dems, and there was a kind of I think no one saw it coming. First of all, and then some people were like, "Oh, this might mean every Lib Dem MP will have to find another 2,000 votes because it will remind people of coalition." And I was sceptical. I don't think because Foreign Secretary isn't the most high-profile person on the average doorsteps. But do you think this is going to cause any problems for the Lib Dems?
No, that isn't. A Cameron coming back isn't a particular problem. The coalition is only mentioned by people who would never vote for us now. And we can see that from the by-elections, both local and national. Nice to win a seat, incidentally, yesterday in Bolton from the Labour Party, which shows us up north can take on the main opposition.
The Tories. Got to correct you. It was.
Was it? Oh, it was in the Labour area. Anyway, as long as we win, it doesn't matter. I think the more difficult thing for the Liberal Democrats is that we've almost disappeared from the news this week. There are great divisions in the Labour Party, the great divisions in the Tory Party. I was hoping that 2 or 3 of our MPs had caused a bit of trouble to get us in the newspapers as well. But we know well that the excellent work being done by Layla Moran, who should be in the most invidious position of all members of Parliament over the Gaza issue, but the fact that our party has been absolutely united in Parliament, and as far as I can see, pretty well united across the country, isn't newsworthy. What we need is a good few rifts and arguments and nastiness.
I think part of that, Alison, might be the fact that when there's a circus going on in the other two parties, the sensible one doesn't get a look in, for whatever look-in we get anyway, which is minimal. Now, Richard has brought in, obviously, what happened with Labour, but we'll come on to that a little bit later, because I do want to stick on, because I think the primary cause of the reshuffle was, of course, Suella Braverman, who is clearly on leadership manoeuvres, as everyone expects. She is basically doing a leadership bid. And we could talk about, first of all, we should go back actually and just talk about some of her language. From a party point of view from Rishi Sunak, I don't know why he let it go on so long before doing it. Once he had got her support for the leadership, he must have known he was letting a fox into the hen house.
I suppose if you think back to a year ago when he became Prime Minister and he'd already lost the leadership contest with Liz Truss during the summer, he kind of knew where his votes were and where his votes weren't. And by doing a deal with Braverman, then that was the way he could secure the leadership and also avoid going out to the membership who had already rejected him once last year. So I suspect he had little choice. And, you know, the challenge for politicians is to think about the medium to long term rather than how you get through the immediate problems in front of you. In fact, I think it was, wasn't David Cameron always described as the essay crisis prime minister? He was always like dealing with, you know, the next 5 days rather than, you know, the next 5 years. So for me, you know, he was just like responding last year to how he could become prime minister. He got that agreement. It held together for a year. Braverman clearly was being increasingly provocative, I think, intentionally, you know, to sort of position herself for a future leader of the Conservative Party role, presumably in the general election. But really, you know, I think he didn't have much choice, did he?
No, I mean, for me, Richard, and I don't know if you agree with it, I mean, I don't care about Suella's particular political machinations. That if she wants to tear apart the Tories, she can do that. What I don't appreciate is someone with the power of the Home Secretary, firstly, undermining the Met Police, because they generally do a good job of that themselves. But her rhetoric was so dangerous. And I do mean that. We saw the far right be emboldened by it on Remembrance Weekend. And I do lay that at the feet of Suella Braverman. She absolutely got what she wanted out of that. And, you know, there were various peaceful protests that day. The one that wasn't was the one that she cooked up.
I don't think she did get what she wanted out of it. Certainly not all she wanted, because there were no arrests amongst the people who were lawfully and legally protesting. Don't forget the vile way that she described them. What she did was to bring out a load of pot-bellied thugs who, if they're representative of my country, I'd certainly want to leave this country. They were violent, they were aggressive, they were ignorant, they had no idea what the cenotaph was, they had no idea what we were commemorating and who was commemorating it. They went to the wrong place at the wrong time. So she brought those loathsome people out onto the streets of London. And I must say, I do have concerns about the Metropolitan Police. I'm satisfied that the Merseyside police are a lot stronger and a lot better linked into the community. But I was proud of the way that the Metropolitan Police behaved last Saturday to safeguard our democracy.
Yeah, Alison, anything further on that?
I just want to take a moment to think about, it wasn't just her language over the Palestine protests, but the week before, her story about homeless people and living in tents and the lifestyle choice. You know, she's been on a number of subjects. She's been incredibly provocative, using horrible language that frankly disgusts me and disgusts an awful lot of people. And glad to see the back of her and glad to see her out of government.
And it's a weird thing, because obviously there's been polling is always taken with a huge pinch of salt, but obviously there's been a fairly decent uptick in Reform and Reclaim's kind of levels of support these last week. And I think what that does, that language doesn't help the Tories, because if anything, it emboldens a flank that probably wouldn't vote, or if would maybe default vote to them. But if you're going to embolden them further, they may go elsewhere, particularly if it's if she then gets sacked, which she was. And I mean, that resignation letter she sent out was just, I mean, we've all had bad bosses in our time. Good grief, did she let rip? And, you know, and it was pretty unhinged. I mean, it was just like, now, I don't know. One of the things that was most interesting is that they said there was a deal that was written down, but who knows if that was true or not, or if that's just her venting because she feels angry and upset, Richard.
If it was true, she'd produce it, wouldn't she?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
I don't think it is. But I think you're talking about just one of the flanks that has been released by this action. You talk about some people moving to the left. There'll be a whole load of people who are already coming our way who are not satisfied by saying that people who live in tents have made a lifestyle choice, who are content that we should have peaceful, legal and lawful demonstrations in this country because it's part of our unwritten constitution. I think it's leaving a nasty block in the middle, which is a rump Tory party, the like of which I've never seen before in the time that I've been in politics.
No, and that's really because we've talked a bit on recent podcasts about how does this feel like the 90s before Blair took over, and we'll talk about Keir Starmer and the Labour side of it, which obviously it isn't Tony Blair, but this Tory party at the moment just feels so dysfunctional. And I know Major had to deal with all sorts of sex and sleaze scandals, but at least I assume there was a level of competence, they thought, after Black Wednesday, that him and Ken Clarke were at least trying to get the ship in some sort of order. At the moment, we are completely rudderless as a country.
Yeah, absolutely. And just going back to David Cameron coming back and his comeback, my thinking is that he's the person that's basically responsible for me having got involved in politics. He was the person that called the European Union referendum and got it wrong and didn't campaign properly and enabled Leave to win. And me, and I'm not the only one, a whole raft of other people in this country thought, actually, I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. I can't just shout at the TV. I need to do something. I need to get involved. So the idea that you'd bring David Cameron back and all your kind of 2017 Remainers would kind of go, oh, brilliant, the Conservative Party. They've re-embraced where they came from. And he was the great foreign policy statesman. I mean, absolutely not. He's probably responsible for one of the worst foreign policy blunders since the Second World War. And it's not going to wash. In terms of does it affect our vote, it's worth looking at the Twitter feed of Mike Martin, who's our PPC for Tunbridge Wells, who was out door knocking on Tuesday morning, and he's got a whole thread of conversations he had with soft Conservatives about what they think about Cameron coming back. And it generally, they just thought, well, it's a blast from the past, and clearly Sunak's desperate.
And it was interesting, the Times Red Box focus group happened on Tuesday, so the day after Cameron, and one of the questions was about that. And because I thought it was quite like a bold move by Sunak. I thought he's thrown something out there that no one was expecting into a little bit of a Hail Mary pass. But the response on this focus group, and I get focus groups again are only 8 to 6 people and all the caveats with that, but it was like kind of, it just seemed more desperate to the public than anything else. And, when you're trying to be the change candidate, which Sunak has from his party conference was trying to do, to then bring back David Cameron maybe doesn't fit with that particular message. And there was and there's a risk there as well, because David Cameron, not only with his reputation for foreign interventions, which aren't great, whether you think of Libya or his dealings with the EU and Brexit, is that the Greensill scandal is still ticking on in the background in terms of his lobbying and his interactions with China. And so Sunak has played this game to try and add some reassurance, but it really could come if David Cameron suddenly gets investigated for something else, which now a lot more journalists will be doing, then this could all seem just add on more pressure to him, Richard.
Well, I think it was a case of desperation. Cameron does have a level of competence which puts him above many of the people in the cabinet now. But he is a voice from the past. He is unelected. He has no mandates. We've got a prime minister with no mandate appointing one of the 4 chief positions of state as someone who wasn't even elected at all. In fact, who resigned from Parliament as soon as he'd realised he'd lost the referendum election. So I don't think it's a move that will carry any weight with the electorate. But also, I'd have to say, what else could Sunak do? Who else has he got? The fact is that it's an extremely lightweight parliamentary party. If you have 30p Lee, ignore the law, lads, we'll just send them over in a plane, as your deputy chair.
That was very good. That was one of your better ones, that, Richard. I'm quite impressed.
Yeah, you put him in a senior position, you know your party's stuff, don't you?
Plus, anything he does, Sunak, you get an idiot like Lee Anderson mentioning that, like Richard's just done about the Rwanda policy, which we're about to talk on, and it destroys any credibility you've got because you've put him as deputy chairman of your party. So every time he spouts off some nonsense on GB News or on his Twitter feed, it destroys your kind of competency argument. But I suppose one of the other things regarding the reshuffle, which I think is obviously is the chaos it causes within kind of Whitehall and the operational government. Now, we politics, we do like to talk about the personalities, but, the amount of different health secretaries we've had, the amount of different housing ministers we've had, some of the major crises facing this country have now again got new ministers that have to find their feet right when we need the government to be ticking on properly. They're starting from scratch. And then you've got issues between the new health secretary. Her husband has got links to the sugar companies. The new environment secretary, his partner has links to water companies that have been dropping sewage in our rivers and our coasts. It's just a mess, an absolute mess, Richard.
Well, one of the most important things that has been overlooked in the reshuffle is the number of competent ministers of state who've just given up. So if, for example, you take Nick Gibb, who's been there for 10 years, he was out for a little time, I think, with Liz Truss, came back again. He is competent, he's capable. Again, I don't always like his policies, but he knew his stuff. And he stood down, as did three others. They claim they've got new jobs or they just want to move on. But what you have taken out behind all the froth at the top is the solid core of people who could do the job. And I think that's actually more disastrous from the country than just replacing a couple of cabinet ministers.
And I wasn't sure, Alison, you might have picked this up if I haven't, and I'm not sure that I did get the impression as well that they were going to get a number of Conservative MPs were told not to announce that they were stepping down at the next election. But I don't know how many of them actually announced that they were this week. I don't think it might have just been lost in the haze of all the news.
Definitely something, wasn't there, about just keeping quiet for a bit longer and not having this flood of announcements of resignations.
Yeah.
And the other thing that happened, so there's Nick Gibb, as Richard says, but also Jeremy Quinn, who's the MP for Horsham, so next door to us. And if Martin Boffey were on this podcast today, he'd be talking about Jeremy Quinn stepping down from his government position, but apparently was also offered housing minister. And it sounded like Sunak had real trouble, like Rachel McLean, who he got rid of as housing minister, we don't know why, didn't want to go. And then he offered it to a load of people and nobody wanted it for some unknown reason. And I can't remember who they've actually put in the end. But the good news is, and what we really need to focus on, is that thank God we've got Esther McVey as Minister for Common Sense, and everything will be okay with Esther pontificating on the news channels for us.
Doing Liverpool proud.
We don't recognise her as a Scouser in any way, shape, or form. Just put that on the record.
You can't keep on saying that. You brought Nadine Dorries and Esther McVey into our world. You guys have to just accept.
And whoever just stood down as DWP coffee.
Yeah.
So on behalf of the people of Liverpool, could I apologise? We abolished the Tory party in Liverpool, and one way we did it was sending the buggers out somewhere else.
But okay, so let's now talk a little bit about, because obviously what's happened since then is we've had two other fairly substantial bits of news as well. Now let's touch, because we talked about reshuffles, one that was kind of enforced, but this time on Labour, is as a consequence of what's happened in Gaza and Israel. Now, as I mentioned in my introduction before we started talking, we are not going to deep dive into that issue. We know lots of people have very strong opinions on it. It is a highly emotive, fast-moving situation in the Middle East. And to be honest, there is so much misinformation and propaganda that I suppose you guys are as well, but I don't know. I'm happy with where the party has landed itself. And I reiterate what Richard said. I do think Layla Moran has really showed leadership and character and compassion, and has been an absolute credit to our party over these last 2 weeks. But one of the issues that is having a big effect is what's happening within Labour. Now, obviously, Labour does tend to have a majority of constituencies that have high Muslim vote in it. So this is obviously very striking. You may have seen on the news that where I live in Preston, the Council of Mosques asked all Labour councillors in the city to call for Keir Starmer to resign. They have not yet done that. But this is just an example of kind of the turmoil that Labour's got. So, for example, the Preston MP, who no one will have heard of because he doesn't do anything, but Mark Hendrick called for a ceasefire several weeks ago, but then when it came to the vote this week, didn't vote for it. And so how that then squares and how Labour manages that is very difficult. And I suppose I'll go to you first, Alison. I mean, what does this mean for Labour? Will these people... Some people have resigned entirely from the Labour Party locally. We've seen lots of them in Oxford. But do we think this will be a momentary thing, or where this vote will come back? Or do we think that this is a long-term issue for Starmer?
I think it will pass. It depends, obviously, how Starmer handles it going forward and how the conflict in Gaza sort of progresses or deteriorates. But the reason why I think it will pass and it won't be a huge problem for Labour was listening to Jess Phillips' interview on the Newsagents podcast yesterday, where although she's resigned as Shadow Minister for protecting women against domestic violence, and she broke with the whip, she says the way that the Labour leadership and the Labour Whip's office handled her and handled her colleagues who also rebelled was not one of coercion and aggression, but one of kind of compassion and understanding. And that did give me sort of hope, really, that the Labour Party's not going to tear itself apart over this. And there is an acknowledgement that there are differences of views, and some people have to vote, had to vote the way they did for conviction.
I mean, she is a Starmer loyalist who... I think that, it would depend on which side of the Labour Party you're on, I imagine. I think Jess Phillips is of the Starmer side, and so this was a vote that she couldn't really not do the way she had done it. And ultimately, Jess Phillips really wants Keir Starmer to be elected. I assume she'll be back in the cabinet fairly quickly. That might not be said for other members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and certainly some of their membership base and their councillor base. What are your impressions? Obviously, you have a large, strong Labour, leftish Labour kind of council, Richard. What's your view on the ground there?
Well, we don't have it such a council at the moment because the Labour Party has already purged them before the last local elections. And there is a small Liverpool Community Independents who are the rump of the left. And I saw no sign in Liverpool of a move away from the Labour Party, although our MP, my local MP, Paula Barker, who I didn't know was a shadow minister, making a big impact in this community, has actually stood down. Those people have nowhere else to go. They can go and join George Galloway, who's been making all sorts of noises and making very little impact. So his time has clearly passed. So I think Alison is right. I think this is short term. It's a bit of annoyance, and I've no doubt that the vast majority of the people who've resigned, either as councillors from the Labour Party or from their positions in Parliament, will stay in the party. They'll be allowed to stand again and will take up their positions again. And most of the people that I saw, people like Jess Phillips, are people I thought are good people. Actually, people we could work with. They're rational, they're not foaming at the mouth lefties, they're reasonable people. There should be a place for them in the Labour Party.
And I suppose from my point of view up here, I also did a couple of canvas sessions. So in one of our target wards, we have an area that has slightly more Muslim voters in it. And it'll be interesting because, that anger at Keir Starmer was very visceral and very noticeable on the door. Now, whether people mentioning it's just like Iraq all over again came up for those of us that obviously for people like myself who joined the Lib Dems because of Charles Kennedy's position on Iraq and that situation. So it will be interesting how Starmer deals with it. I think the proof will tell whether how Labour is going to go forward in terms of, I mean, I'm still, like I've said on this podcast numerous times, I do think the Labour support is very soft in terms of it's huge. That polling range is massive, but actually it hasn't taken much to knock certain people off from and there are people with really strong views on whether or not there should be a ceasefire and really don't understand why Keir Starmer is calling for long humanitarian pauses compared to a ceasefire, and it feels like he's dancing a little bit on the head of a pin in terms of his language. But that will be interesting going forward to see how that happens. Another big policy that came up was a Supreme Court justice ruling on Rwanda. Now, obviously, Suella Braverman would have been front and centre, and can you imagine the language she would have used after this court case? But it was. I think, Alison, it was really disingenuous how the government played this afterwards. And you might think, well, you'd expect that. But they were blaming foreign courts for a ruling of a British domestic court was a kind of a stretch. And it was interesting that even on the Spectator's daily podcast, they said they accused the government of not really being truthful and for confusing the issue deliberately.
Conservative government not being truthful?
Yeah, shocked.
Who would have thought? Yeah, they've got themselves into a bit of a mess here, haven't they? You know, promised everything. Turns out it's not legal. I mean, probably could have told them that 18 months ago, about 3 Home Secretaries ago as well. But overwhelmingly,
£140 million would have been saved.
Incredibly expensive. What a waste of money. And, you know, you can't turn black to white and white to black just because you want it to be different. You cannot just say, well, we're going to write a treaty and then Rwanda's issues with human rights will be written away because we want to make it so. So quite where they go from here, I don't know. They're in a mess.
Because Richard, because Parliament is sovereign. I mean, they could change the law on this, but they haven't. In fact, and Suella Braverman did 2 attempts on migration bills and hasn't yet sorted out the legal. So this is their own mess.
It's absolutely their own mess. And don't forget, even when a sovereign parliament makes decision, it can still be subject to overrides by what is now the Supreme Court. And I think that's absolutely right. But let's also think of the chaos that could have ensued, that might have been avoided. Particularly district councils were extremely concerned that to get a large number of people out on the plains to Rwanda, there was going to be a huge increase in the number of cases, which wouldn't have been looked at adequately. And people have been flooding out of government payment in their accommodation onto the streets, with the councils having to pick them up. And that would have bankrupted a lot of district councils for whom housing is the major function. So what we need is a rational policy, part of which would be to say, why are we spending so much money to keep people doing nothing when many of them have the skills to do jobs that are badly needed? We are 220,000 people short in our health and social care services. Why don't we let some of those people get a job so they can pay their taxes, so we're not paying out for them? This is idiotic policy. It's not rational. It's damaging to the individuals. It's damaging to our collective wallets, and it's not delivering the work that our communities badly need.
And they focus, Alison, on the wrong aspect. So they say, like, oh, we want to stop the boat. Nobody wants small boats crossing the English Channel. You know, that is a failure of policy if they're even getting on the boats. But the idea is, oh, we're spending X amount of million a day on hotels. Well, actually, that's a failure again of your immigration policy and actually getting that right in terms of having an absolute system that is on the near of collapse and taking months upon months to actually process claims, which are then, vast majority of them are accepted as being genuine. It's just shambles, Alison. And I mean, you're obviously further south than me and Richard. I mean, how does this play down in the wonderful world of Mid-Sussex?
Very interestingly, I mean, I pick up on Richard's point about the responsibilities districts and boroughs have down here as a housing authority and to provide temporary accommodation for people who are homeless. It is a source of huge worry to councils right through Kent and Sussex that there is potentially going to be a great surge of demand for temporary accommodation from people made homeless because of Home Office policy and because they're closing some of these asylum hotels. I want to be really Lib Dem here and talk very local government, but we are in a situation where the sector, as in the local government sector, is staring down the gun barrel of collapse, I think, in its finances. Hastings, for example, I think it's paying out something like £5 million a year on temporary accommodation, and that's just totally unsustainable for a small district or borough authority to sustain that for any amount of time. And there is no focus from central government on what they're going to do when it's not just one or two authorities who are in lots of trouble, but it's the whole, a lot of the sector really struggling. You can't just put it down to one or two bad decisions in one or two rogue authorities after that.
So, Richard, there's an awful lot going on in the world. Your thoughts of where the Lib Dems are right now? We've got local elections next year. We'll have a general election at some point next year, we assume. Police and Crime Commissioner elections. We are a campaigning podcast that likes to give people advice. I suppose from your point of view, it's get out there and try and win as much as you can.
I've just bundled up my Christmas cards. So absolutely. I am very proud at the moment, partly because of what's happening in Parliament, to be a Liberal Democrat. I've seen about 5 surges of the party in the time I've been a member. This is a strong one. I'm looking forward to a general election. I'm looking forward to any elections at the moment. Let's go out with the clarity of our Liberal Democrat principles, put into place with our Liberal Democrat marketing and community focus, and we can win lots of elections next year.
And with that, Alison, I don't think we can add anything to that. And do you think so? I think Sir Richard, which is it's bound to come at some point, the Knighthood, Richard. So we might as well start calling it now. But no, just thank you so much, Alison and Richard, for coming on the podcast today. Like I said, lots of stuff to talk about. Do ask us any questions. Do comment underneath us, whether it's on YouTube or on our podcast or any other place you see and hear the Lib Dem podcast. Just let us know what you think. We'll be back with loads more episodes coming up on all sorts, because I don't think the news is going to stop anytime soon. I think there's going to be all sorts of things going on, and we'll obviously be starting to think about how we can get you guys up to speed and ready to go for those May elections for those of you that have them. So thank you very much for watching. Do keep in touch with us, do keep listening, do keep watching, and we'll be back with another episode very soon.